Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Marjorie Celona, Assistant Professor in the Creative Writing program at U of O. She joined the faculty in 2015. Celona's first novel, Why, was published in 2012. Her short stories, essays, and book reviews have appeared in the Best American Non-Required Reading, The Believer, Elle Magazine, and the Globe and Mail, among others. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Why?
That is the question, isn't it? About a decade ago, I started thinking about this character named Shannon, who was abandoned at the YMCA as a baby. And I wrote a short story in which she started the journey to find her birth mother. And it was a short story that I wrote as a very young woman, and so it had no resolution. It just sort of petered out and came to an end, as many of our early stories do. I picked up on it again a couple of years ago and thought, now's the time to turn this into a novel. That she was a voice that stayed with me, a voice that stayed in my head for a very, very long time. And so I decided that I would complete her search. The short story ended with her finding the man who had found her as a little baby, but that's where it ended. So the novel, I thought, why don't I complete that search? Why don't I have her find her birth mother? And then once I decided to do that, I realized I needed to tell her birth mother's story as well. And so there was an alternating storyline. I alternated the storylines chapter by chapter, brought the two women closer together.
So let's talk a little bit about, a little more about Why.
Sure.
Because the title is the letter Y. And the resonances of this letter Y are extremely rich and complex throughout the novel. So say a little bit about the significance of the letter Y.
Sure. So I mean, that was the character, but the novel did start, or the idea did start from two places. One, it was Shannon, and the other was a fascination with the letter Y, which was born out of reading manuscripts for the Malahat Review, where I worked as an intern as a very young person at the University of Victoria. And I started to notice, as I read through the manuscripts that were coming in to be considered for publication, I started thinking that a lot of them started with the letter Y. It was just a thing that I noticed, and started thinking about the letter and what it looked like and what it sounded like. And out of that came the kind of prose poem that begins the novel.
Would you read the prose poem that begins the novel?
Absolutely. Why? That perfect letter. The wishbone, fork in the road, empty wine glass. The question we ask over and over. Why? Me with my arms outstretched, feet in first position. The chromosome half of us don't have. Second to last in the alphabet, almost there. Coupled with an L, let's make an adverb. A modest X, legs closed. Y or N? Yes, of course. Upside down peace sign, little bird tracks in the sand. Y, a Greek letter, joined the Latin alphabet after the Romans conquered Greece in the 1st century. A double agent, consonant and vowel. No one used adverbs before then, and no one was happy.
That's such a wonderful prose poem, and you know, in that one page, you've just unpacked all these resonances of that letter. But one of the most amazing things is how many of those resonances get played out in the novel. So you described the structure of the novel,
right.
Alternating chapters that are focused on these two characters who are separated from each other. How is that a Y shape? Say what happens that the shape of the letter Y is relevant to the structure of the novel.
Sure. So if you look at a letter Y, it's either one path diverging into two, or it's two paths converging into one. And so there's a duality there, just in the shape of the letter itself. So the structure of the novel can be seen as two paths, Shannon's path and Shannon's birth mother, and their path towards each other. It can also be seen as sort of all Shannon's path. So there is a duality also in the point of view of this novel, that it is a first-person omniscient masquerading as first-person alternating with third-person. So the sections that are told from Eula's point of view, Eula, Shannon's mother, seem to be in third person. At some point in the novel, I hope the reader starts to doubt, and the reader wonders if this is all Shannon the whole time, and thus it has been Shannon making up these stories as we go. This is also a novel that deals with decisions. So the fork in the road is probably, you know, one of the other images that comes up again and again. The nature of split decisions, the decision to abandon the baby, the decision to set out on the path to find her mother. Both Shannon and Eula make terrible decisions in this book and have to face the consequences. And I think part of the writing of this, or the pleasure of writing this, was investigating that.
You spoke briefly about the striking narrative perspective. So, plenty of novels written in first-person perspective. Very few are first-person omniscient. Usually that first-person narrator is a limited narrator or an unreliable narrator. That's the first thing. The second thing is it's in present tense. Often first-person narratives are in the past tense because they're retrospective. So say a little bit more about, I mean, those are inventive, sort of experimental techniques, it seems to me. Why did you choose to write an omniscient first-person narrator and in the present tense?
I think it came from attending a reading a very long time ago, and I have forgotten the writer and I have forgotten the book, but what stayed with me, he was reading from a memoir, and what stayed with me was that he was reading the prologue or the first chapter of the memoir, and it was told from his perspective as a baby traveling in the car in his mother's tummy still on the way to be born. And it served to characterize his parents, and it characterized the setting and sort of where this memoir was going to take place and who his parents were. But I remember sitting in the audience and thinking, well, okay, if you can do that with nonfiction, surely we can see around a first-person narrator in fiction. So that was sort of one part of it. The other part is that the short stories that I'd written up into the writing of Why the novel, so many of them had been in first person, and I was tired of it, that I wanted to write in third person. So the alternating chapters, first person, first person, third person, that was how I wrote the book, just also to give myself a break from that I.
And what about the present tense?
So the present tense, I think I liked the immediacy of it. The line that first came to me that begins the novel, Why, that perfect letter, it just seemed, I'm not sure that I have a good reason for choosing the present tense. The first line of chapter 1, my life begins at the why, it just seemed begins. The tense, the present tense of begins, that we are beginning a journey, we are on the road with this character. It seemed right. I don't think I could have written the novel with the first line, my life began at the why. And perhaps that's all the answer I can give.
Well, that's a good answer. That's a good answer. The protagonist of Why, Shannon, is it's a coming of age story. So it's a young person. That story ends, she's 17 years old. You have a recent story, Othello, which is also about it's a couple of kids, a 17-year-old and a 6-year-old. What is it about young narrators that interest you?
I think it's their privileged position of both insider and outsider, both in society and within their families. So I write about families. I mean, if I had to just say, you know, one word, what do I write about? Which I'm often asked to do. I just answer that. I say families or dysfunctional families. And so to tell those stories from the perspective of a child or from the perspective of a teenager allows me to sort of have a protagonist or a narrator who can function as a spy, as a double agent. So, you know, he or she is in the family, also outside of the family. He or she is in society, but also outside of it, observing, trying to see the cracks. So I think that's part of it, that I very much like the sort of detective work that children do and that teenagers do, trying to piece together their identities, trying to piece together who on earth their parents are. I like that. I think that it sort of naturally lends itself to storytelling.
It's very interesting because the novel really has a kind of narrative drive that a mystery has.
Yes.
Because you, like Shannon, want to know this mystery.
Right.
Why? And that really is a fascinating point about that's the mystery that we all have about our parents. You said, I write about dysfunctional families. As far as I'm concerned, that's the only kind of families there are.
I think you're right, Paul.
One other question about Othello, the story that I just alluded to. That's narrated by a 17-year-old boy. Say a little bit about your interest in narrating. I mean, Shannon is a girl, but you don't seem to have any hesitation to occupy the subjectivity of a person who's dramatically unlike you. I know that people have asked you, is Shannon based on you, and you say no.
Right.
But Vernon is really unlike you. So what about that?
Sure. Shannon, for all intents and purposes, is a girl, but she also isn't. So she's androgynous in appearance. She's to some degree asexual. She doesn't menstruate and feels as though she never will. So the idea that she is a girl, okay, maybe, but also maybe she isn't. Vernon, however, doesn't quibble with those things in the short story Othello. He presents himself as male. It's not an issue for him. I think when I write, well, I just think as a person, Paul, I'm not sure I've ever had a female thought. And so when I write this idea of gender or gendered thinking or a character who's a woman or a character who's a man, it starts to blur and the character is just an entity. It's just a voice. It's just a being.
Interesting. We've talked a little bit about perspective. One of the many striking things about Shannon is that she's blind in one eye. Say a little bit about that.
Sure. When we first sold the novel, my editor at Simon & Schuster called me and we talked for an hour about the book, and she asked me, Marjorie, why is Shannon blind in one eye? And I hesitated and I hesitated. And after a while I said, because she is. And that's really just about all I have ever been able to come up with for a good answer as to why she is. She just is.
Okay, this makes me think of a related question. So Y has been very well received by critics. It's won or been shortlisted for a number of prestigious prizes. Has the novel's reception by readers and critics changed or affected how you understand the novel? That is to say, have you learned things about the novel that you didn't realize, or about the characters that you didn't realize based on the way that the novel and the characters have affected other readers?
Yes, in that the reader's response and critics' response make you take a good hard look at the book that you've written. I think I needed some time to go by. I mean, initially you're just sort of affected on an emotional level by a review or by a reader response, either positively or negatively. And then as time goes on, you sort of let yourself really just listen to what they're saying, regardless of whether it's positive or negative. And so I did start to think more about the structure of why after the fact. I don't think as I wrote it I was really thinking about the shape of a why, quite frankly. So that was something that I thought about after, that I sort of wondered if I'd been thinking about it subconsciously, but that was sort of something that was pointed out that I was not thinking about as I wrote the novel. So that's one thing. The other was that so many readers and a couple of critics were more interested or sort of sided with Eula more so than Shannon. Shannon's mother. That was interesting to me. I mean, in the writing of Why, I felt as though, because Shannon's my main character, I felt as though I had given her the most weight, or she was the closest to my heart. She felt the most real to me. So it's fascinating to hear that other characters felt more real to the readers. I'm not sure that changed my, understanding of the novel or my relationship to the novel, but it did give me pause.
One of the things I found really most fascinating about the character of Shannon is, the life that she has is one of difficulty and hardship, and some of it is pretty horrifying. But she's such a strong, humane person, and I should say your one of your gifts is to render a character with extreme complexity and understanding, even characters like Harrison, her dad, who there are parts that it's pretty bleak about him.
Sure.
What is it about this? What's your feeling about the human spirit or the human condition that I mean, this could have been a really depressing novel, it seems to me, and it's really not a depressing novel at all. Why is that something that's important to you?
I think I'm a more hopeful writer than I am a person. I don't know why. But I do know that when I set out to write, I'm interested in drawing a complete circle around a character and seeing them from 360 degrees. And so that means investigating all of their flaws and then all of the wonderful things about them. So in that respect, even sort of bad guys in the novel like Harrison, I love him as I'm writing him. And I think that love translates, to a bit of love on the part of the reader too. Anyway, I mean, it's just an interesting exercise for me to try to see fully around each character.
So you are from Vancouver Island, and the novel seems to take place on Vancouver Island. Place seems to be an important part of it. Why is place important for you when you're writing? Where the story occurs important?
It's not important in all of my work. It became important in Why. It was something that I imposed on the novel maybe halfway through its writing, that at the time I was living in upstate New York, which reminded me, the atmosphere of upstate New York, the dense sort of forest, the air reminded me of Vancouver Island, and I started to miss it. By then I think I'd been living in the US for 5 or 6 years. I started thinking about the island again, and I left the island being very sick of the island, so I was surprised that I was thinking about it again. And what I thought I would do then was I'd preserve the Vancouver Island of my memory, the Vancouver Island of the 80s and 90s, the Vancouver Island that I grew up in that is different from the Vancouver Island now. So in some ways it also became an exercise in memorialization or preservation of place. And that's where and how I love setting and place in fiction, is just that you can do that. You can preserve a time and place that no longer exists.
You are a novelist, you're a short story writer, you're an essayist. Why is it important for you to write in these different forms?
Well, I'm working on a second novel right now, and the monster then that I'm wrestling with that is plot, and that was the monster that I wrestled with Why. When I write a short story, I'm less interested in plot and I'm more interested in language. I'm more interested in scene work and the work of moment to moment. essays then, you know, become a different exercise. I think it's just that. It's different exercises. It's working different muscles.
Excellent. So you're an alumna of the very esteemed Iowa Writers Workshop.
Mm.
How did that influence you as a writer? How did that impact you as a writer?
Hugely. As a teenager, my favorite writer was Kurt Vonnegut, and every time I would come to the end of his novel, there it would be, you know, in his little bio, a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. He also taught there, you know, so I was fascinated by the place for so long. It seemed like a place I would never get to growing up on Vancouver Island, which is isolated in so many different ways. When I got there, I mean, what's not to love? They gave me all this money and I wrote for 2 years. What's not to love about that? It was absolutely transformative to have somebody say, come to this also isolated place in the middle of America, here's some money, go write, we'll see you in a couple years.
So you've taught at a number of places, but now you're an assistant professor at the University of Oregon. This is your first year. What attracted you here?
I like Eugene. So my parents are from the Bay Area. So as a child, we always drove from Victoria, took the ferry to Vancouver, and then drove down to San Francisco to see my grandparents. We did this so many times that on the way, you know, I thought about every single place that we would drive through, Eugene being one of them. So it's sort of always been on my radar as a place. When I saw that the position had opened up here, naturally, being from the West Coast, I felt pulled here just geographically. The other part of it is the desire to teach in an MFA program, and to teach in an MFA program that is so selective. I mean, we only admit 5 applicants a year, and that to me seems so special, so wonderful, so different from Iowa, in which 25 new applicants in fiction are admitted every year. So it's a very, very different type of program. But the work that Oregon does with their master's students is so intense, so incredible. The opportunity for mentorship, for close reading with your students, for sort of watching them transform over the 2 years. I mean, what wasn't to love about that?
So you've just raised a sense of yourself as a teacher. So you're not just a creative writer, you're a teacher of fiction writing. How has the experience of being a teacher affected your writing?
I may have to teach for a few more years before I can really answer that question, Paul. I lead a very compartmentalized life right now. I have my teaching life, I have my writing life. I'm also a parent to a young child. So I try to very much separate them. Part of becoming a writer after graduating, after getting your MFA, is leaving the voices behind, leaving the voices of your professors and your classmates behind. And so when I write now, I try to leave every voice behind, especially my own voice as a teacher.
So let me ask this question a different way.
Sure.
How do you see the role of the creative writing teacher? I mean, sometimes I'm an English professor. I teach literature courses, and students say, I'd like to write something creatively, and I say, I don't know how to teach you to do that.
Right.
How do you do that?
By not teaching, I guess. I mean, we do a lot of what I try to do is identifying a literary ancestor for the student. You know, saying to the student, your work seems as though it's in the vein of Alice Munro or Raymond Carver or whoever, Edward P. Jones. Let us look and see how they have done what they have done and try to learn something from them. I think also my role is really of editor too. I mean, the work that I did with my editors at Simon & Schuster is so actually very similar to the work that I do with my students. We identify the strengths in the manuscript, then we identify the weaknesses, and we see what can be done about it.
Who are your literary ancestors?
Alice Munro. Alice Munro is definitely the closest literary ancestor to my heart, at least right now. I mean, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I would have said Kurt Vonnegut, but I haven't read Vonnegut in a decade. So.
What is it about Munro that's so powerful for you?
Part of it is place, the way that she's preserving parts of Western Ontario and British Columbia, and the times that she's writing in. Another part of it is just that we have watched her characters grow older as she has grown older. And so there's this wonderful sort of arc of what it's like to be a woman from a young girl all the way to an elderly woman that she's offered us with her whole body of work.
Are you working on something new?
I am. It's a second novel.
You don't want to tell me anything about it?
I don't.
Yeah, so I'll ask you a different question.
Okay.
So we have about 2 minutes left. Whenever I get the opportunity to interview a creative writer, I always say, can you recommend anything that you've read recently for our viewers that you think they should read?
Sure. The last great novel that I read was Lila by Marilyn Robinson. And it's sort of, it's her fourth novel, but it's linked to two of her other novels, Gilead and Home. And it tells the story of Lila, who's she grows up as a migrant worker and then sort of becomes homeless, arrives in Gilead and marries the Reverend John Ames, who is the narrator of Gilead, who is her second novel. That is the way those two are linked. But it's sort of her story from this terrible hardscrabble life into one of safety and love. It's just profoundly beautiful.
You like stories about characters over time who learn and develop. We're basically out of time. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today about your work, your recommendations, your process. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul.
I've been speaking with Marjorie Celona, assistant professor in the U of O's Creative Writing program. She's the author of the novel Why. Thanks so much for watching.